Welcome to the Poets and Philosophers podcast. I'm Abe,
And I'm Sam.
and we respect the great tradition.
We're also brothers.
We talk about the great ideas in the Christian life.
If you love philosophy, old books, ancient ideas, and God, subscribe now.
Today we discuss Kierkegaard and his emphasis on silence and thinking to live well. Kierkegaard was a man who lived in the late 1800s, and one of the quotes that I know that I'm familiar with from him goes along the lines of, if I were to prescribe something for the modern ills of the ills of the modern age, I would prescribe silence. Now he was writing in the late 1800s, so this is not at all with the technological revolution of today. So he was writing a long time ago, and he has some things to say to us about silence and thinking and living well. And I think even though he writes a while ago, the stuff still speaks to us today, which is kind of like the whole main thrust of this podcast as we discuss these old ideas and say, look, hey, they were talking about things that somebody else could talk about today, but because they don't have certain cultural, they're not engaged or they're not inside our culture, they can tell us things that they can show us blind spots that we just don't have. And I really, really appreciate that about the ancient ideas. Today, though, I'm a fish out of water. I have only read a few works of Kierkegaard, where Sam, I feel like every time we talk about these things, he's always mentioning Kierkegaard here and there. So Sam is going to pull this episode. At least that's the hope. So
Yeah,
Sam,
hopefully.
Sam, who is Kierkegaard? Who is this guy? Tell us a little bit about this guy before we jump into his ideas on silence.
He was actually in the beginning of the 18th century, or in the 1800s. So he was born in 1813, and he died in 1855. He is an elusive character. He is a very intelligent person. He's written a lot. Most of his books are written pseudonymously. He didn't attribute them to himself. He actually made these fictitious people that would write them, and each person represented a certain way of thought, and it was a way for him to experiment with certain ideas. And he kind of wanted philosophical immunity because he knew some of these ideas were needing to be said, but yet he wasn't sure if he believed them. So some of his pseudonymous authors he considered to be more spiritual than himself, and some of them were not as spiritual. And one book that we're going to somewhat discuss is The Present Age. And one thing that Kierkegaard saw was the press would publish a lot of newspapers, and he thought today was just a day where people talk. It's all about chatter and talkativeness.
Which is hilarious considering he wrote so long ago, where today it's like magnified by maybe 100-fold. So it's really wild.
Yeah. And I mean, we see the newspaper was a new technology. Today we have all these kinds of new technology, but the newspaper was really very, I guess, important to the city, and a lot of people were just talking about it. And he thought that people were so much in thought that they really committed suicide. Like, they weren't people because all they did was think. They never actually did something. He says that people actually wanted to commit suicide, but the moment they decided, they actually thought too much, and then they never committed suicide. But he said in that moment they did commit suicide because they never actually had the courage to do anything. So Kierkegaard was very concerned for the public and their tendency to discuss things. He says nothing ever happens today but publicity. So it's this idea that we talk a lot, we watch the news a lot, we get on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, but we aren't really doing anything. We're just talking, and nothing ever happens but publicity. So I think Kierkegaard is someone for today. He was not a professor. A lot of people I think this is true. A lot of the people in the great tradition were professors, and there are a few that were not professors. Kierkegaard is one of them. Nietzsche, he taught for a little bit, but he when he wrote most of his stuff, he was not a teacher at the university. So he is a marginalized figure. He talks against academic institutions, specifically Hegel's system there in Germany. But he's talking against these because, one, they're just promoting people not to do anything, just to be consumed with thought, and he's against that.
So I guess a little bit more background. Like, where is he from, and like, what kind of education did he get?
Okay, Kierkegaard was born in Copenhagen, I think. Yeah, he was born in Copenhagen. He died in Copenhagen, Denmark. And the one of the biggest concerns, I guess, of Kierkegaard too was that Denmark was Lutheran, and every person who was born was Lutheran, and he thought that Christianity was so easy for everyone that they thought that they were Christians. And one of his tasks was to make faith difficult. That's what he wanted to do. So, you know how Socrates was the gadfly of Athens? He wanted to make people struggle to have good ideas. He wanted to challenge people because they thought their ideas were good just because they had them. But he said, no, you have to, well, Kierkegaard wants to be the gadfly to the church, specifically the church in Denmark. And he wants people to think, and he challenged people, and he wanted to be an evangelist to the church. He wanted to attack Christendom and make people think about their faith. His biggest question is, what does Christianity mean to me? It's not, is it true? He believed it was true, but Hegel and so many intellectuals were pretty much saying, it's true, we need to show the truth of it. And he's like, I don't really care if it's true or not. What does it mean to me if it is true? And he actually wanted it to be uncertain because he knows faith only operates in uncertainties. Faith can't happen if you're certain. That's how he understands it. So he wants to make sure, like, Lessing's ditch, Abe.
Yeah. If you'd explain it to me, I'd probably be like, oh, yeah, that's it. It's like hard to tell because like you got Lessing's ditch, you got Schrodinger's cat, and a couple other things. I'm like, yeah, sure. But yeah,
so Lessing thought that we can't really know anything about history because the distance when you study anything historical is so vast that it's a ditch. It's an ugly, great ditch. So if I want to learn about Jesus Christ historically, there's an ugly ditch between us, and I can't get over it. And Lessing pretty much said we can't know anything about history through the writings of history. And
I wonder what he thought about whenever his works were published. Can we know anything about his works,
Yeah, good. So obviously there's a good reason that Christians should combat someone who thinks that, right? Right. Our faith is based in the resurrection as a historical event. If the resurrection did not happen, our faith is vain, as Paul said. Well, Kierkegaard actually thanks Lessing. He says we need to kiss Lessing on the face because we need to realize that we don't know. And that's where faith comes in. And that's where, you have this idea of leap of faith. That is, Kierkegaard began that. We need to leap over that ugly ditch. We need to leap of faith. And so Kierkegaard's all about being authentic and making choices, existing as a person. Faith is not something to know. It's an existence to live. So, like, if I'm a good Bible student, it's not that I'm participating a lot in class. A good Bible student is a person who exists every day of his life, struggling to be the Christian that God wants us to be. So I think that's kind of his thought. And his education, he had a classical education. He like everyone back then had a classical education, but he read a lot about Socrates. Actually, his dissertation was on Socrates. It's on the irony of Socrates, and he never he got his degree, which was really his doctorate in divinity, but he never was a preacher. He was never ordained in the Lutheran church, and therefore a lot of his discourses, I know, Abe, you read a discourse of his. He doesn't call it a sermon. He actually doesn't think he can call it a sermon. He calls it an upbuilding discourse. So it's just kind of funny. But he wrote sermons, and he might have preached a few times, but he was not ordained.
He sounds like one of those characters it's really helpful because he's so weird in his approach. Like this whole, like he's creating, in my mind, as I'm listening to you explain it, and he's probably more sophisticated about some of this stuff. I'm sure he is. But he's creating these false dichotomies in his mind about, faith is where you have to believe without the evidence, and that whole process of, well, the less we know, the more we can have faith in. Just to me, that seems a little backwards. But I appreciate what he's trying to do with thinking in those terms, because he's afraid that people are just believing what they're believing simply because, well, this is just has the best evidence. And as long as it has the best evidence, this is what I'm going to believe. And it's like, if that's how you think through Christianity, at least, if you find something else that has better evidence in your mind, then you're just going to go and follow that. And so you don't really have any loyalties to the thing itself. You have loyalties to your mind's ability to rationally think through what is true. And he's trying to say, what we have to do at some point is that, yes, that there's reasons, but our faith has to ground us after or even before our reasons. And it seems like he's fighting against that.
Yeah,
Because he
and
sees cultural Christianity. I mean, it's funny to listen to that because it sounds like he could be talking today, or at least today or several decades ago, about the problem in America of cultural Christianity, that everybody just nods and hat tips to Christianity as this cultural cachet you can dig into, and you can say, God bless America in your political speeches. And then, everything's like, oh, he's one of us. And so we can just buy into whatever he might say, and that's fine. So I appreciate him trying to live an authentic, to use that buzzword, an authentic Christian life, and that has to deal with a radical faith that you have to stop questioning things every so often and just do what God calls us to do. That seems to be part of what he's getting at.
yeah, and for Kierkegaard, um, it's not the belief with the absence of evidence. He thinks that there's a lot of people that have shown a lot, but people are so interested in objectivity, and they're so worried because of certainty, and the Enlightenment was all about certainty. We want to be certain. Descartes wanting to try to think, what is the one thing you can't doubt? And well, the only thing that you can't doubt is thought itself. Because in order to doubt thought, you have to think. So it's this desire for certainty where Kierkegaard's saying, stop. We are at a good place now. What does it mean to you? What is it? Is it actually going to change your life? And I know in college there was a buddy of mine who was in my biblical studies degree. He became an atheist, and I would talk with him, and he actually went to one of my professors, Dr. Dickey, and he said, Dr. Dickey, I see this evidence for Christianity. I also see this evidence for atheism. And Dr. Dickey said, you can mount up all the evidence for Christianity, and you can mount all the evidence for atheism. But guess what? No amount of evidence is ever going to make you believe. It's never going to compel faith. You have to do that. And that's really Kierkegaard's project. He's saying, guess what? Even if there are certainties out there, you have to change your life. That's where Kierkegaard says truth is subjectivity, and you need to make sure, and I think this is a problem in churches today, where truth, being true is more so knowing what is right. It's not about appropriating that truth to your life, existentially, whatever that means. But
Yeah, I was reading. I forget if I was reading or I was listening to somebody talking about preachers today, that we do a lot of explanation, but we don't do a lot of proclamation. And I think that's a really good distinction there, because what you want to do is you want to explain the text and why this is true or why this is important or whatever it might be, without actually doing that faith part, where you switch into a mode of proclamation, saying this is true, this is what God wants us to do, and look at the good things God has for us, and let us do these things, and behold, the majesty of God, versus background studying of the text. So yeah, he seems to be a good character. I'm glad we had this little bit of talk before we jumped into the project of silence, because reading him, those of you who are listening and decide, oh, hey, this sounds like a good guy, I want to read. Yeah, go ahead and read him. But this is, to me, Kierkegaard's very hard to read. He like, in particular, and maybe we'll talk about this at some point, Sam, if whenever we can. But he talks a lot about leveling, and I had no idea. Like, I was about to go and research what he means by leveling in the middle of this present age, and I was like, or the present age, and I was like, okay, eventually I may understand him, but I didn't get to the point. But he ended up using it a lot, so maybe we can talk about that at some point. So I hope you can see why he's important for today. And right now we're going to discuss really his simple thought, or one of his big thoughts. It seems to be on silence. So I think the first question we should ask is, why did Kierkegaard believe silence to be something that is so important? And what did he mean even by silence, I should say?
Yeah, silence it's not the absence of speaking. It is a kind of posture where you empty yourself and you are ready to listen. That's where silence is. Also very important. So we're going to talk about the different benefits of silence in different domains of our life, but we need to empty ourselves, listen to what is to be listened to, and then obey what is being asked of us. So today, silence is very important. Actually, one of 21 Pilots' songs, I now forget what song it is, but it's about, I think it's called The Radio. It's something about the radio, but really the song is where I think his radio was stolen out of his car, and he can't stand it because all these thoughts are going in his head, and he wants to get them out, and he's being faced with himself, and he doesn't want that, and he just wishes he could get his radio back. And I'm going to read a few lines. He says, I ponder of something terrifying, because this time there's no sound to hide behind. I find out the course of our human existence. One thing consists of consistence, and it's that we're all battling fear. Oh dear, I don't know if we know why we're here. Oh my, too deep. Please stop thinking. I liked it better when my car had sound. So we live in an age where we are constantly either thumbing through our iPhones to see our posts. We're constantly listening to podcasts. And I was telling you, Abe, earlier that I am very much guilty of this. As far as when I go out for a run, I want to be listening to a podcast, an audiobook, or music. And when I'm going to work, I try to do it, even if it's just classical music. And I think that there might be a time where classical music can help you be silent. But today is a day of publicity, of talkativeness, chatter, and it's very important for today. And one thing that he says in one of his sermons called "The Lily of the field and the bird of the air, that the that there are moments to be experienced throughout life, but you can only experience a moment in silence. So he says, what's a quote from him? He says, "Only in silence is the moment." That's on page 24. Only in silence is the moment. So think about this. Think about you being at the bus stop without friends. You're waiting to go to school. You know how many kids have so many great.
Sam, I don't know if you noticed this or not, but I was homeschooled, so I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, it's
No,
the
no, I
idea
get it. I
that
get it.
it's these times where before you go off on your adventure, before you go off to school, I don't know, when was the time that we had time to think? We couldn't even do it at the breakfast table because we were probably talking at that time.
Right. Or I was reading like the cereal boxes all over. So
Yeah, that was one of your characteristics. Um, Reading cereal
yeah, no,
boxes.
I hear you though. As far as just like how, like, you're in line at the store and you're just waiting in line for like the next person, and like, what does just about everybody do? They flip open their phone, they listen to something, or as soon as they get in the car, what are they gonna do? They're gonna like flip open it and listen to something. This happens, or like a lot of people, including me sometimes. The first thing you do when you wake up is that you let your phone do your thinking for you, where you check your notifications, you check your social media feeds. And I think most of us understand just how bad that is for us. I remember in particular, so I was teaching at not teaching, but I was a counselor at a camp, a summer camp, and it was a whole week long. And one of the rules we were as counselors that we told the kids, you cannot bring your phone to camp. Um, there was like special permissions for some kids, but it was like the counselor had the phone. But basically, these kids couldn't have their phone the whole time. And it was always really funny at the end of camp whenever we would turn their devices over, because we could hear them and see them. And like some of the kids were like, I need to change my phone habits. I realized how much I'm dependent on this thing to help me basically get through the day and pump me up with dopamine. They didn't use those terms, but I mean, that's like the common internet, alpha male vernacular now. It's like all these dopamine hits on their phones. So then some of them, they would just like go right to it and just start flipping through and whatever, like they didn't care. But some of them would really have like this almost this crisis moment where, am I going to go back to the way it was? And I think it's important. This song about the dude losing his radio, the same thing as far as he didn't want to think too hard. And I think that that's very dangerous to be in that mode of thinking. That reminds me of, I forget who thought of this, but it was some productivity dude on a podcast. He called them monk mode mornings. Have you heard of that term? So monk mode mornings were just this idea that, I forget who it is. I should look it up, but the guy just thought, all right, I am going to not check my email. I'm not going to do anything until noon, as far as like uh, checking my inbound messages. Like maybe I'll write, maybe I will read a book or whatever it might be. I know it's not the same thing as what we're talking about as far as silence goes, but limiting the amount of input somebody is getting during the morning. And I really like that idea. I know that I'll catch myself whenever I'm folding laundry, be like, all right, should I go get my phone to go listen to something really quick? And I'm like, no. I should just fold my clothes and in silence. Or if I'm going to go like out and about with the boys, like, should I go get my headphones to go listen to something? No. I think this time I'm just gonna walk and not pay attention to anything else. And I find that when I do that, it is very helpful. I think in the notes here somewhere, you've say that whenever you like run without music, you almost get like a wealth of sermon material for preaching. And I find the same way. That is really helpful, is to just, yeah. I even find like when I'm listening to sermons, like that can happen. Like there's a certain silence there because I'm not talking. And like I find my mind can wander sometimes upon the points that he's making. And then I'll be like, hey, this is a good point too, that this guy helped me find out. So that's helpful as well. But
One
I've
of Kierkegaard's main themes is despair, being in
really, okay.
despair or being anxious. And what Kierkegaard says the human is, or the self is, the self, I'll explain this, but the self is the relation between the self relating to itself. So,
Well, that sounds exactly like something Kierkegaard would say.
yes, very much so. But it's this idea that I am a self, right? And I am constantly relating myself to myself. There's a dialogue in me. So guess what? When I'm alone, I think about who I am presently and how that is so different than who I want to be, correct? And I am the relation of doing that. I'm not the self relating to itself. I'm the relation between the self relating to itself. So I am a person who am constantly in despair about who I am and who I should be, and knowing that God is going to hold me accountable to who I am today. And when you are alone, folding the socks, um, waiting for the gas to fill up, making breakfast, on a run, going to work in your car, you have a time to relate yourself to yourself, but you can only experience that pregnant moment through silence. And a lot of people who don't do that, and again, this does cause fear sometimes, and that's where this guy with the song 21 Pilots, um, there's an anxiety if you haven't faced yourself. You even if you have not done it for a while, and I wonder if a lot of people through COVID have had to face themselves and be silent and be away from people and that chatter. Probably not because of social media, but if you have not been around people and you do get to have times of silence, you're going to reflect on who you are and who you should be. Um, so what was I going
Yeah,
to say? Yeah.
I don't know, but yeah, clearly that silence is important for us as human beings to have those moments, because life comes at us fast, and those moments help us slow down and confront with our own particular problems that we're facing in life. So I guess when it comes to like reading, before you've got some notes in here, I think that are helpful for us to think through. And so when we're reading, but when we're silent, why is it important to be silent before we read classical works?
I think this might come from Gadmer, um, but it's the idea that when I approach a classical work, and I'm specifically talking about a classical work, it's a work of an age that I don't really know. It's a very different time, a different culture. What am I bringing to the text? And always know that I am bringing something to the text, right? I have, if me and my wife had a dispute, I'm going to be emotional and I'm going to bring something to the text. That time of silence is a way to empty yourself and to make sure you're not going to push onto the text something that's not there. And when you read an ancient work, it is the most, kind of like what we're saying with Kierkegaard, but Kierkegaard's somewhat the exception. You're reading someone who thinks so differently than you, and you are actually jumping in that person's subjectivity in order to understand their thoughts after them. One thing we talk about as Christians, we try to read God's thoughts after him, or we try to think God's thoughts after him. That's the task of theology, I hear. Well, as a I don't know, classicist, a humanist, I want to think the thoughts after the people that wrote them. And I can only do that if I am silent. I get rid of my prejudgments, and I try to control my own pre-understandings, because I cannot approach a text objectively. I need to know that. I'm going to throw stuff on the text, but if I'm aware of that, kudos. That's great. And I need to be aware of that. So one thing we need to do is make sure that we're aware of our pre-understandings. We're aware of what we're going to put on the text. Every time, if I read Kierkegaard's sermon, I need to leave my front door, enter the church building of where he's preaching it, smell, the dust on the vestibule, and be able to sit there on his terms and listen to him in, 1850 in Denmark. And that is the task of that you do that out of love for the person, because I have to understand him on his terms.
Yeah, and that silence almost gives us that gap in between. It's like, it's like in movies, like before like a big moment in a movie, whether it's like a wedding or a performance or whatever it might be. It's like if they're rushing to it right before they open the door to walk into the scene, they take a deep breath and go, okay, here we go. And I think it's exactly what Kierkegaard is getting to. Like, we understand that in our own self to do those for those little moment of just going, all right, take a deep breath and walk in, And I think for us, we can take that even further and realize that there are moments that we're going to have to do this before we read classical works, because I think you're right, as far as we have to be aware of who we are when we're reading, and aware of our own particular situation that we bring to the table whenever we read. And that's really important, because what's easy to do is to make whatever author you're reading basically agree with what you already know to be true. And so you'll just focus on those parts that you agree with. It's like I think it was Albert Schweitzer talked about with the Jesus, the quest for I forget, the Jesus
The quest
of
for the
history.
historical.
Yeah, the quest for the historical Jesus. He says, this Jesus that they're finding sounds a lot like modern. He sounds like a modern theologian, because basically he was making the argument that what's happening is people are just looking at Jesus and they're making Jesus into their own image. And that's dangerous to do. So not only is it important for us to do this before reading classical works, if it's important for us to read for classical works, be silent before we read them, it's also important for us to do this before Scripture, because whatever pitfalls we may have reading classical works, those pitfalls are also there whenever we read Scripture, because we may understand the text only in the ways it's been preached to us beforehand, or only in the ways that the books have been read to us beforehand. Whereas the goal is to read them on the terms in which they have been written to us in the beginning. Because if we are not reading them on their terms, but rather reading them from whatever tradition we'll be coming from, we're going to miss something. And that's a dangerous, is to just basically read the text to confirm what you already know to be true. And that, to me, is pretty rough. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, with love, if you love, like, if my wife writes something to me, and if I love her, I am going to try to understand what she has written, and giving her the benefit of the doubt, and trying to understand that she could be saying something differently than how I think something to be. And I think out of love, there is going to be a difference. My subjectivity and her subjectivity are different, or we could say my consciousness and her consciousness is different. And if I really want to jump in her shoes and see what she wrote to me, I want to be sympathetic to the differences, the nuances of what she's saying. So I think it's out of love for the ancients. I don't want someone to read something of mine, 500 years from now, though I know I'm not going to be someone who would be read then. But I don't want someone to read
You can just say 50, 50 years from now.
50, maybe 50 years from now. I don't want them to read thinking I am just confirming their own beliefs, because I'm probably not. I mean, even 50 years from now, I'm not sure if I'm going to be as relevant to someone, who's younger. Anyways, so I think that out of love, we need to be silent, think through our own, pre-understandings, silence is a precondition to actually interpreting a text.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think most people would probably insert here, especially when it comes to reading a text, is not only is silence important, but that prayer is important, and that seeking God before we read His Word, or even during we read His Word. One of the interesting things that helped me, or at least it made me reflect a little bit, was I was reading some of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica about contemplation and meditation. And in this little blurb before he gets into that, it was this author talking a bit about Thomas Aquinas. And one of the things that he would do, especially when he was translating or writing his commentary on the book of Isaiah, was he would come upon a text he couldn't understand, and he would fast and he would weep, and like people would say that he would always walk around with like tears in his eyes because he was just trying to think about how do I interpret this text, and he would seek God in interpreting it, which is very interesting for us. When a lot of us think of Thomas Aquinas, we think of like these super intelligent dude who's writing down these great ideas and just seems to be like, basically like if he sounds like if Spock wrote, theology, because he's so exact in his wording and so precise. But Thomas Aquinas was somebody who sought God when he was trying to study, and he was fasting, and he was weeping before God to be able to translate the text. And I'm sure he spent a good deal of time in silence, waiting to know how do I translate this. It sounds really melodramatic for us to hear such things, but I think it speaks more about our age than it does about him, as far as our reflection towards God and His Word. So I think it's good. So
I think this
yeah.
Let's talk about silence in interpreting specifically scripture and not just classical literature. So I know in our first podcast, I think we talked about, is the Bible a great book? And that's actually a question that I've been thinking about a lot lately. Is the Bible one of the great books? Yes, it talks about reality. It it is helping us see what is there. But the Bible is categorically different because it was authoritatively written by God through a person, but it was by God. And all the other great books were simply written by geniuses who see things differently than me. So when I read when I read scripture, I need to read it as in the posture of being submissive, listening to understand in order to obey. And that is where Kierkegaard talks about talkativeness is really the opposite of obedience. If you're someone who's always talking, you're never going to obey. I think about a story when we were in Poughkeepsie, I think in New York. When Dad was up there preaching, there was when we would get in trouble, he would stop, he'd look at us, and we knew we were in trouble, and I hated that. Well, there was a time where I was on the pew, I acted up, Dad looked at me, it was very painful for him just to be quiet and look at me. And then after the closing prayer, after the during the song, at least me, and I'm not sure if Abe, you would do it, but we would run back to Dad, and we could, Dad would walk to the back of the church building, be at the back door, and I could just be in his arms, and he would greet people as people left. Well, I still ran back and jumped in Dad's arms, and I knew after the prayer he was going to talk to me about me misbehaving in church. What I did immediately, and I remember it, I started talking about anything. I don't know what I talked about, but I talked about anything because I knew he was going to reprimand me for my, misbehaving in church. And that is what Kierkegaard sees as talkativeness. You're just talking because you don't want to listen. You want to throw out your ideas because you are your own person. And that's a lot what that's how the world sees life. They're on their own person. They don't really need to listen to anyone. There's no authority figure out there. Maybe the police, but there's no authority figure out there. And silence is obeying God. It's coming to the text saying, it is I, the text, am talking to. I'm sorry, it is I the text is talking about, and I need to appropriate whatever it's saying. So for Kierkegaard, specifically in reading scripture, we need to listen in silence and just do what the text asks us to do and not talk about it, but just to do it.
Yeah. Um, I think these are all important points to make because, yeah, I mean, I remember. I mean, you meet people like this all the time. Not just you being a little kid doing that sort of thing, but like you just like you can almost just hear the sort of vocal register people have when they seem to be just talking about the text just to like talk about it, and then like that this is probably this is somebody who they don't talk like this outside of like a Bible class setting or even a church setting. Like they never talk like this, but like they just want to use those words and fill up that time almost to say, well, I talk like this here, so you can like you don't need to get on my back about my life outside of the classroom or outside of the church when we meet together. So, or just in regular conversation, some people do this all the time where they're really flighty, and it's like just like you don't have to talk so much. All right, you can like chill out a bit. I'm not gonna accuse you of anything. I don't know why you're all a little. You seem like you're trying to hide something. you know.
Yeah.
So it's not just you, but it's a lot of people that are like this. So how do you think individuals can cultivate this sort of silence?
We talked a little bit about before how you had these moments of silence throughout your day. I think you talked about in the store, or I talked about being at the bus stop because I've heard about students talking about them thinking through the day, thinking through their own lives at the stops, at the bus stop. That's obviously if you don't have friends there to carouse with, but um, we all have times in our day where there is going to be silence. And why don't we, rather than pulling our phone out, or, yeah, why don't we have a moment, be silent in order for that pregnant moment of significance come upon you? Because there are so many throughout our day. And it is really only those people who are thoughtful who can really learn sometimes without reading a great book. They can learn about themselves and the way, that's one of the big is it Delphic Oracle, the Oracle on Delphi. Know yourself. You can know yourself because yourself is a self relating to itself. You can look at yourself, relate, and learn. In a way, one of our episodes before, we talked about the midwife, right? Uh, Being a midwife, helping students come to the truth and pulling it out of them. In a way, you can be your own midwife through a moment. You can allow and see the truth come out of you if you just think about it. And, we don't all need a Nathan the prophet to convict us. We can do it if we just stop and think and have a moment. So whether that's, waiting for your gas to fill up, whether you're filling up your water. I know my wife was telling me about a friend of hers who their water spigot is very slow at their house. And to fill up their glass of water, it actually could take almost to a minute. And they just stand there. And this is kind of trivial, but just that could be a moment for them just to think. But don't escape those times of silence. That's the first practical thing. Don't escape those times and really just think. Be quiet be willing to listen to what is being said and make assume a posture of humility and obedience when you hear something.
Yeah. I think those are all really important moments. I know that I don't know if we're going to do a whole episode on walking and thinking, but we might at some point. But that it seems to be uh, uh, a theme throughout many of the great writers who talk a lot about thinking and walking. I forget which author. It might have been Nietzsche or somebody else who said something along the lines of, "I don't trust thoughts that don't come from people walking around and thinking." And I think it's an important practice. I think that particularly going through nature, it's important to do that. I know Cal Newport. Some of the people might have read some of his books, like Deep Work or Digital Minimalism. I think I've got both of those books, and he talks a lot about this idea of walking to think, and especially in I think Deep Work is one of them. But then in Digital Minimalism, he talks about how Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War would he would have a house that was nearby the Capitol or the White House, and he would a lot of times just go off and walk around without anybody around him, and he would just go walk around the place and think about how, how to handle what would come next. And he attributed a lot of his ability to think about how to participate and to handle the Civil War by going out and thinking without any sort of distraction around him. And for somebody who's as busy as a president would be, um, if he can find those places to go around and walk, I think we can as well. I think some of us who have a lot of like those responsibilities that are just on top of us all the time, it's hard, especially like taking care of little kids. I think it's really hard to find time of silence to think, but they do go to sleep, and that can be a time where we just are in silence doing something.
And
So,
you also think about Jesus, the time that he
oh
found of
yeah,
silence is while I think people were sleeping, at least before people started becoming very active. And
yeah,
that was his time where he made that a priority. And one way that we think about classical philosophers, even before I think Socrates' time, I could be wrong about this, but even Socrates, they were called peripatetics, the peripatetic school. That was just peripatetic means, walkers. And it was the people who went out and walked. They went outside of the city to think about what is there. And Kierkegaard was known for going on a lot of walks. And throughout his writing, he would write, and he wrote a lot. And he was also not married, but he wrote a lot. But he needed to go out and walk. And then also, Henry David Thoreau, who wrote the book Walden, he was a transcendentalist, but he lived at the time of Kierkegaard himself, but he talks about the importance of walking and how, yeah, great books are great. And one of the books he had, I think, was Homer's Iliad. He found a lot of value, but he said, but also you need to be able to walk and just think. And that's one thing that I need to learn, and I need to um, certainly schedule for my I guess inner life.
yeah. I think everybody has to do that to be more well-rounded as a person, is to find those moments of silence. I'm sure if we looked at just about any philosophic or meditative tradition, there's a lot to do with this sort of silence. And even in the Psalms, a lot about it in Christ's own life. He walked and meditated and just got up in the morning before everybody else did, and went out to pray. And I think even in the prayer there was probably some time just to think about what to do. Even before he chose his disciples, he did that, or his apostles, he did
And
that.
there's a lot of apps right now focused on meditation. It's a very current thing. I know my father-in-law has a Peloton, and I have the app on my phone, so I kind of get it for free. But on the app, there's a whole section for meditation. And I've done the 20-minute one a few times and the 10-minute one. Some of them are a little bit weird for me
Yeah,
because,
guided meditation is it guided meditation?
yes, it is.
Oh man,
And it's
if you don't
like,
get the
think
right
of,
voice, it's like the worst.
but even it's not just that, it's the content. It's saying, think about someone who you love. Wish them well. Wish them well. Now, think about someone, not someone that you really dislike, but someone that you have a problem with. Wish them well. Wish them well. Now, wish yourself well. Great
Yeah,
job. And it's like, I don't really know if I like that. I'm not completely against self care,
you
but
just
it's
don't
the
like
idea
wishing
that
people well. That's what
I
it
don't like
is.
wishing people
Get
well
well
during my
yourself.
meditation. Yeah. They don't need
Why do I have
me.
to do it for you?
Yeah. But I do think that there's going to be some meditation apps. One that is, I think, $12 a month, which is way too much for me at least. But I actually forget what it was now.
Is it
But
Headspace?
yes, I think it's
Oh
Headspace.
yeah, that
And
guy's voice. I didn't actually do it, but I did a couple of them, and it's just think about just sitting there alone by yourself. You're like, dude, stop. If I do it, that sort of thing, I don't even I don't listen to people, man. I have not found somebody I wanted to listen to. I remember it was like I was listening to a Christian meditation one. It was like you're in a place and you see Jesus and he invites you to come sit with him. And you're like, no, dude, this is too weird for me. No. So I think when it comes to silence, to go back to what we're supposed to be talking about, um, that all those apps, I think, are kind of the opposite of what should be happening. Like it's still somebody guiding your thoughts. Where I think it's better left to just let your mind wander, but focus, like kind of guiding it to focus on the things that you should be focusing on, and not these imaginary things that they want to come up with. Because
so I wouldn't
oh
necessarily say that uh, those aren't helpful. Maybe this is just a point where me and you disagree, but I I think that there's the Eastern idea, I believe, where you meditate to become nothing. That is not necessarily what silence is, at least as I understand it, or as Kierkegaard understand it. He does say silence is becoming nothing before God, and that is where you realize your faults and you know your weaknesses. But I do think that Christians normally are a little bit funny about meditation because it is an Eastern idea, and it's just weird to them. They almost think that this is polytheistic. That is not at all what we're discussing.
yeah, yeah,
Um, but it's the idea of before prayer to get you in a good place. Pray. Now, obviously, you need to go before God if you are very anxious or if you're emotional. God can handle your feelings. And
hmm
if you just read the lament psalms, you know that God can handle your feelings. But there are times to be quiet, to allow some things to leave, especially before you read. But before you pray and approach the God who is completely different than you,
hmm
approach him in reverence and not just as an old person in the sky. So
sure,
maybe this
yeah,
kind of piggybacks on our last podcast with classical theism. You're approaching someone very, very different. You need to become very silent. And just like you said, before you go into a wedding, you kind of check yourself. Check yourself before you enter the throne room.
hmm
And that's where silence, I think, can be very, very significant.
yeah. I'm teaching a class for the high school students, really just for is a number of kids, but teaching a class on apologetics. And one of the things I tried to do for a little bit in the beginning, at least, was just talk about how Christianity and even just the Jewish tradition was a tradition about thinking. And there's a great tradition there of people who thought, and not so much. Um, Yeah. So they thought a lot. So one of the ways that I brought this out is that the Hebrew word for what we normally translate as meditation is Haggah, which literally means to hum a low sound or to utter a low sound or to grunt, not grunt, but moan even. And so I like that idea because like whenever you're thinking about something really, really hard, everyone kind of goes, hmm, hmm, like
Ye-
that's it. Like I think that's what it's going for. I'm not a Hebrew scholar or anything like that, but there seems to be that sense of like when you're really thinking about something, like you do utter that sound and just kind of go, hmm. Like I don't know why we do that, but we do that. So that's part of what it means, I think, to be silent is to just focus on something really, really hard and to let yourself be encapsulated by whatever it is you're thinking about versus, I see it in other people, but normally I kind of, if I see it a lot in other people, I'm like, I probably have a problem with this too. It's probably why I'm so mad at them. So if I see people who just like always pop it in their headphones or, always fubbing, which is like that weird term. I don't know where it came from. Just like messing around on your phone just to mess around on it. I know that I do that a lot. And, um, it's always good to take a break away from that sort of that pattern. So Kierkegaard, somebody living in the 1800s, has a few things to say about being silent in his day. And it just sounds, to me, it sounds crazy that somebody in his day, like maybe I don't have a good understanding of the 1800s enough to really know, but it seems like somebody in his day would kind of come to our day and just go, you guys are sick. Like this is a sick culture. Like you guys are just a bunch of, he wouldn't use this term, but you guys are just a bunch of NPCs, which is that great meme, so an NPC in game is called a non-playable character. So like, you go to the dude who's like your shopkeeper and they just talk because that's what their job is. Or you get the person who's like, help, I need 5 bear skins to make my bed. Can you go kill 5 bear skins for me? Or buy 5. You're like, okay, I'll accept this quest and keep going. Basically, they're NPCs. They're just programmed to talk these words. You can't play these characters or whatever. So the NPC culture or the NPC meme is just like everybody, or like there's a mob in the world called that are NPCs. Like they're just out there repeating lines that they're just supposed to repeat. Or sheeple would be another one. There's sheep people, another good one. And in our day, like we see that clearly. And I'm sure he would kind of go, oh, yeah, I totally see it here. So the way he wants us to combat this idea is to just spend some time in silence so that way you can understand yourself relating to yourself. And so that's a practice that it's not only Kierkegaard. I'm sure if we wanted to take some more time, we could look at not just Kierkegaard, but other people in history who've spent time and said this is a practice that we have to have because like, how do you know that you know what you know and it's not just something that you're repeating because you've just been taught it? And that's something that once you know what you know, then you are much more convicted and able to go and talk about that in the public sphere. Like even proclaiming Christ. Like some people, well, I just don't know. And it's like, it could be because you've been taught your whole life and you never actually have gone to go, all right, do I believe this to be true? And if I believe this to be true, am I actually going to take it seriously enough to go out in the public and to really say what it is that I believe? So, anything else, Sam, before we close this episode out that you wanted to hit on?
No, I can't think of anything.
Well, we appreciate everybody listening to this podcast. If you are listening to us on a platform in which you can give us a review, we would really appreciate review. We particularly love those 5-star reviews. Those really help get this message out here. And one of the best ways that a podcast can really grow is by word of mouth. And so if you know that something like what we've talked about or any of our previous episodes would be beneficial to somebody you know, share it with them. Share it on social media. Share it on wherever. And take some time today to take out your headphones, put your phone down, or put it on silence, and get away spend some time in prayer even, and just spend some time to think and to be silent. We appreciate you guys, and we will catch you guys in the next episode.